Thanks for tuning in. If you enjoy the content, don't forget to hit subscribe and give this video a like. It helps more than you might think. On July 4th, 1892, a couple, Mr. Henry Declan and Mrs. Grace Declan from Pennsylvania, moved to their new cottage home up a hill in Mendocino, California. A few months later, Mrs. Grace Declan was found lying on the floor of her home alone in a pool of blood. The hunters who found her noticed she was still breathing and took her to the General Hospital in Mendocino town. She was immediately taken into the emergency ward, where the doctors confirmed several severe bite marks on her body. After a few days, she was able to speak. What she told the authorities was shocking and terrifying. This is her story. "I have never witnessed anything like that before. I thought that I was going to die. I don't wish to ever go up that hill again. What I am about to tell you would sound unreal because I too did not believe it until it happened to me. It was the seventh suitor I had just rejected. My mother already felt the need to disown me. I can still hear her voice in my head scolding me. She always reminded me that I was the first child and needed to be out making a family with my husband. The day a merchant came to our home in Pennsylvania as a suitor was the day that I saw my husband, Henry Declan. He had just moved into town that week. Later on, I discovered that he had just arrived from the war and wanted to start a family just like I did. I can remember when we first met. It was at a festival. We talked and laughed about many things, but he didn't want to talk about his family. I can't remember why, but he mentioned something about not having anyone around anymore. He asked that we get married. What better man could I have wished for than a man who had served his country so well and wanted to start a home? I did not hesitate to say yes to him. So, during the winter, we got married. I thought my mother would finally smile on me, but instead, she said that having the merchant as a suitor would have been much better than marrying a man with no family. But I was happy, and so I moved to his home still in Pennsylvania. I thought that was the end of my family being on my neck, but instead, it got worse. They would always come and pry in our business. Henry didn't like that they pried, and I didn't like it either. Henry started working in a school so he would have time to make a family. He saved up money, and then one day he told me that he had found us a new home in Mendocino, California. At first, I was skeptical about moving because I had never stayed far away from my family. They were the only people I had known all my life. But then, with the prying and my mother already asking for a grandchild in the few months of our marriage, I thought it was wise to see this new home that Henry had talked about. And so, we moved to a cottage up a hill in Mendocino, California. I can still remember the day that we moved. The sun was already high in the sky when we finally left Pennsylvania. I waved goodbye to my mother and sisters. I can remember at the time that I still wasn't sure about the way I felt, but I trusted Henry enough to want to do it with him. It was a new beginning for Henry and me, a chance to start over in a place where no one knew us. I wanted to take the horse-drawn carriage my family had gifted me at our wedding, but Henry insisted we sell it. He managed to rent a small, sputtering automobile. He insisted that we take it with us, claiming that it would be faster and more comfortable than the carriage. The road to Mendocino was long. We passed through hills and forests. The automobile emitted a cloud of smoke and occasionally stopped. Henry seemed to enjoy fiddling with the car, but I found it more trouble than it was worth. As we traveled, I was curious. I had never been to California before. Henry, on the other hand, seemed more focused on the road ahead. He was a quiet man, and I didn't know him very well. We had only been married for a few weeks, and I was still learning about him. I tried to start a conversation with him, but he seemed uninterested. He kept glancing at the road ahead. I wondered what he was thinking about. As the day wore on, I began to feel a little tired and hungry. I asked Henry if we could stop for lunch, but he said he wanted to keep going. Finally, after what seemed like hours, we reached Mendocino. The town was even more charming than I had imagined. We drove through the town. Then, Henry turned up a hill and pulled into a driveway. This was our new home, a small cottage in between trees. I was excited to start making it our own. As we got out of the carriage, Henry went around to the back of the car and started unloading our belongings. Then, I noticed something strange. He was carrying a large, heavy trunk. It was so heavy that he had to struggle to lift it. I asked him what was in the trunk, but he just smiled and said it was nothing. I didn't think much of it at the time. I was too excited about our new home. Such beautiful weather during the summer. Henry had it all planned out for us to be comfortable. He had even built a barn at one end of our home. But everything changed when Henry told me he wanted to start hunting. I had never seen him hunt, so I never thought that he was going to be able to. But then, he reminded me of his years in the army, and so I felt relaxed. He went a couple of times, but returned home with nothing. "Don't worry, you'll get something tomorrow," I'd say to him whenever he came home. Every day I tried to calm him down, assuring him that he would get something next time. This continued for a while. Gradually, we ran out of food at home. I had to go downhill to buy food from the local market, which took hours. So one morning I told Henry, "I think we should move out of the hill and go into town." "Why?" he had asked. "So we can easily get the supplies we need and talk to people." "We don't need people, and we have meat. We can eat meat. But you hardly get anything. Not even a rabbit or a deer," I told him. But then, what he said next surprised me. He said, "Is it a deer you need?" I wanted us to get something more. I didn't know what he meant by more, and so I told him the deer would be fine. Going into town to trade and returning to the cottage in a day became nearly impossible. I noticed that Henry had still not gone to try out the hunting, so I complained again. But this time Henry asked me to stop going to the market. I tried to protest because that was the only means of our survival, but he kept saying hunting would give us enough to eat. I listened and stopped going off to the market in town. The hunting season began, but Henry did not go to hunt. He would sit in all day staring out a window or smoking a pipe. One day, 3 men passed through the hill. I found out they were hunters as they held their guns and traps. As soon as they passed by, I remember hurrying inside the house to meet Henry, and I told him about the hunters that I had seen. I said, "Maybe you have been doing the whole hunting thing wrong. That's why you haven't gotten anything. Perhaps, if you hurried now, you would catch up with the hunters. You can ask that you hunt with them." I advised that he follow them to learn their skills and tricks with the animals. For once, Henry listened, but he didn't take up the hunting gun that hung on the wall. Instead, he walked into the barn and returned with an axe, blowpipe, and some traps. I asked him why he had chosen to go along with the axe and blowpipe and not his gun, and he said that the gun had developed a fault, and the axe and blowpipe were all that he needed. That day he went hunting, but did not return when he was supposed to. I got scared and worried, thinking maybe a bear had got him and the other hunters, as I had not seen them pass by. I wanted to go after him, so I got into the cottage to search for a weapon. There were only small kitchen knives. I thought of going to the barn, but then sighted the gun on the wall. I took it and examined it, but couldn't find any fault. Well, I couldn't tell if it was faulty because I wasn't familiar with one, but I took it along anyway. Just as I got outside, Henry returned with a huge bag across his shoulder that dripped with blood. He told me that he had been lucky and caught an antelope. He sounded excited, and so was I. He told me that he needed to slaughter it in the barn before giving me a part for dinner. I offered to help him with the antelope in the barn, but he told me he didn't want me to soil my hands. So I returned to the kitchen and prepared the vegetables for dinner. I can still remember how proud I was. That night, we had a feast, just the 2 of us. In the following days, Henry did not go hunting, but we had more meat as the days passed. One day, when Henry was out into town, I noticed a group of people pass by the hill. I didn't know what was happening, so I had to ask. They said something about some people missing. I didn't know who was missing, so I didn't ask any further. When Henry returned, I told him about the people I had seen, and we both agreed that he should never go hunting alone. So, whenever hunters passed to go hunting, he would tag along and return with an antelope or a deer wrapped up in a bag. He would take it to his barn to slaughter, and we would have meat for weeks. I didn't know how he kept the meat coming, especially when he didn't go hunting, but I loved that we didn't lack. I began selling some of the meats off in the market when he was out of the house to avoid them going bad. The hunting season was on again, but not many hunters passed by for Henry to tag along. We were running out of meat. That day, I remembered that I had gone in to speak with Henry about a water leak or something related to that when I heard him talking. It was as though he was talking to someone. I didn't know who he was talking to because there was no one else in the house. I stood just by the entrance of the door and peeked into the room. The room was a bit gloomy at the time as it was nearly dark outside, but I could still see him. He was sitting in front of the wall as if he was talking to it. I was terrified and troubled that my husband has gone mad. It troubled me for days, and so one night I decided to ask him about it. But Henry denied ever sitting in front of a wall talking all alone. Weeks passed, and I fell very ill. Whenever I told Henry that I needed to be taken to see a doctor, he always found a way of changing the topic of the conversation into something else. Although I noticed this, I didn't say anything. I only hoped that he would change his mind. One day, he returned home with herbs. I only got worse after I took them. I asked him to let me send for my sisters who worked in the infirmary, that they would have an idea of what I was sick of. He agreed to it, and I sent word to my family. They sent my 2 sisters to look after me. My sisters ran some tests on me and discovered that I was suffering from food poisoning. It surprised me because we only ate fresh meat and vegetables. They gave me some medications and wanted to leave, but I begged them to stay some extra days. They agreed. But when I woke up one morning, they had picked up their luggage and left. But they had left a note stating that they had to leave because they were called back to the infirmary. Henry had stopped going hunting, but on this day, he went to hunt. As soon as he went off to hunt, and I returned to the house, I discovered that he had left his hunting tools. So, I followed behind him with them, hoping to catch up with him before he wandered too far. I followed his tracks for a while, but farther into the woods, I lost track of him. I looked around for a while but found nothing. I had almost turned back to leave when I noticed a part of the ground close to an oak tree partly heaped, like a shallow grave. Just as I got closer, I noticed that there were a couple of hunters' belongings stuffed in it. It was strange because when I tried to think about the hunters that always passed along the hill, I remember them going to hunt but never returning. Just behind the tree, I found a tunnel leading through a mountain, and I followed it. This is where I realized that the tunnel led to the barn that Henry had built. Just as I stepped into the barn, I found my sisters. I couldn't believe my eyes. They were chained to a pole. They were still alive but could barely speak and had strange bite marks on their body. I had never been terrified in my life. As I tried to break them free, my hands trembled. They told me that Henry had chained them and he was going to kill them. I tried to pull down the chain when I was struck by a dart, and I passed out. By the time I opened my eyes again, I was in the bedroom chained to the wall. My heartbeat increased as I thought of what Henry would do to me and my sisters. There was no one to call for help. Even the hunters had stopped passing through, as those who did never return. I asked Henry what was going on, but he said nothing. I cried and begged that he let my sisters and I go, but he said that he had never really tried someone vulnerable. I didn't know what he meant until he started biting the flesh off my legs and then my arms. I screamed and passed out, and when I opened my eyes again, he continued. It was hell. Then, he took out the locks from me and asked me to run. I tried to, but he caught up to me as I got to the living room and continued biting the flesh from my back and neck. I shouted in pain. I knew he was going to kill me. But then, I heard a gunshot which made Henry stop. He looked through the window before stepping out. I knew he went out to check who had shot the gun, and it was a good time for me to run. But I couldn't feel any part of my body again. I laid there and waited for him to return and finish me off, but he didn't. All I could think about were my sisters. I didn't know who had shot the gun and why. Maybe a hunter, or my sisters somehow got off their chains. I hope he doesn't catch up to them or anyone else, as he belongs in the forest among the wild beasts. As blood oozed off my body, I shut my eyes. I didn't know how long I had been there. Could be a day or two, but it was painfully slow. I waited to take my last breath until I heard voices and felt someone carry me off the ground. After she told her story, the authorities confirmed the hunters were truly missing. They sent some men to invade the cottage up the hill in Mendocino to hunt down Henry and look for Grace's sisters. But when they arrived at the hill, everything had been burnt down. They continued looking through the ashes and found some chains that Grace had described in the part where the barn previously was, but didn't find any tunnel. The search for Grace's sisters and Henry lasted for months, but they never found them. Grace's parents sued Grace for the disappearance of her sisters. They suspected that she was part of it. But Grace only spent a year in prison, after which she was released. She left Mendocino and has never since been seen. But the people of Mendocino, whether believing Grace's story or not, never went up that hill to hunt again. You've made it. For now, thank you for joining on this horrifying journey. If you want more, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and to follow on other platforms. There are many more stories to come, and if you enjoyed this, please like the video. It really helps. Let me know your favorite part or any suggestions in the comments below. Until next time, stay safe, if you can.